Congratulations! You've just woken up in the year 1325. But don't get too excited. There's no parade, no fresh croissants waiting for you, and absolutely no indoor plumbing. The good news is that you're alive. The bad news? So are the fleas. They've been having a party in your straw mattress long before you arrived. Let's begin with your morning. The medieval version of an alarm clock isn't a gentle buzz or a melodic ringtone. It's the clang of a church bell that sounds more like a punishment than a wake-up call. It reverberates through your bones and rattles the very idea of sleep. The bell rings not just to tell the time, but to remind everyone in your village that God is watching, the day is beginning, and your suffering isn't over. Your bed, or more accurately, your vaguely mattress-shaped infestation, is half-rotted straw stuffed into a sagging sack that might once have been burlap. It smells like mold, wet hay, and possibly defeat. There's no such thing as thread count here. The blanket thrown over you feels like it's made of scratchy wool mixed with sandpaper. And its color? That special shade of gray-brown that everything in the Middle Ages eventually turns. You rise, slowly, not because you're lazy, but because moving hurts. Sleeping on straw means your joints feel like they've been rusted shut overnight. Also, there's no privacy. You, your family, your goats, and a few dozen lice all share the same single-room home. Privacy is a luxury for nobles. For you, it's more of a theoretical concept. Let's talk about the structure you're waking up in. A one-room wooden hut with an open hearth in the middle, a hole in the roof for smoke, and dirt floors that double as a playground for insects. No windows, just wooden shutters that you hear someone coughing, a dry, rattling sound from the corner. Maybe it's your grandmother, or maybe your neighbor, because walls are thin and everyone sounds like they're dying slowly. Coughs are as common as greetings here. Respiratory health? That's wishful thinking. You breathe in the smoky air, thick with soot from the fire that never quite extinguished overnight, and start your day already short of breath. And yet, this is normal. This is routine. The average medieval person didn't consider this suffering. They just called it life. When you're born into a world with no expectations of comfort, you adjust. You become immune to squalor, used to hunger, and numb to cold. Or you die trying. This is where medieval resilience comes in. We might joke about how terrible life was, but these people survived conditions that would have the modern person calling customer service or writing a furious Yelp review, if such things existed. Instead, their coping mechanisms included prayer, superstition, and biting sarcasm. Some things never change. Let's not forget about the livestock in the room. Literally, a goat bleats softly next to your sleeping pallet, and there's a chicken roosting on the edge of your stool. Why? Because keeping animals inside keeps them warm and safe from thieves. Also, their body heat might be the only thing keeping the room above freezing. It's not charming, it's survival. You stretch, avoiding stepping on the toddler sleeping nearby. Children don't. Now that you're officially awake, it's time for the most important part of the day, not dying. Welcome to your medieval morning routine, where thriving is optional, but surviving is mandatory. There's no coffee, no bagel, no motivational podcast reminding you to live your best life. Here, your best life starts with not stepping on a nail and ends with hopefully making it to dusk without dysentery. Your first task? Fetch water. And no, it's not as simple as turning a faucet. That luxury is still centuries away. In 1325, water comes from one of three places: a well in the village square, a nearby stream, or, if you're particularly unfortunate, a rain barrel or stagnant pond. You grab a wooden bucket, heavy, splintery, and vaguely damp from yesterday, and set off down the dirt path that leads into the heart of your tiny, mud-splattered community. Let's talk about the road. It isn't paved. It's not even flat. It's a patchwork of hardened mud, ruts, and mystery puddles. The kind of road where every step is a gamble. Is that water? Animal urine? Something worse? You don't know. You don't ask. You just try not to slip. As you pass your neighbors' huts, you catch a whiff of life in progress. Wood smoke, livestock, damp earth, unwashed bodies. With luck, you've got a bit of pottage left from the night before. Pottage is the medieval peasant's staple, a thin, gloopy stew made from grains, water, and whatever vegetables you didn't sell, lose, or watch rot in the fields. There's no bacon, no sugar, no spice. It's not flavorful, it's functional. You ladle a scoop into a wooden bowl, drop a crust of hard bread in the center, and serve it to your family. There's no silverware. You eat with your hands or use a communal wooden spoon. Everyone shares. Germ theory is centuries away, so double-dipping isn't just common, it's inevitable. Now, let's say you're one of the lucky peasants with access to a chicken or two. That egg you find? That's not for breakfast. That egg is wealth, a currency, something to trade or sell or save for the Sabbath. You wouldn't waste it on yourself unless it was a feast day, or unless you were starving. By now, the sun is fully up. The rooster has crowed at least 5 times, and the village is stirring to life. You've eaten your meager breakfast, washed your bowl, wiped it on your tunic, and now it's time to work. But first, you have one more thing to handle: waste disposal. There's no toilet, no outhouse, just a chamber pot, or, if you're outside, the bushes. If you're in town, a communal cesspit might exist, basically a fancy hole in the ground. Otherwise, people simply toss their waste into the street. "Gardy-loo," they shout, a courtesy warning before dumping the contents of a chamber pot from the upper story of a building. If you're walking by, too bad. Hope you're fast. This is one reason people wore wide-brimmed hats and long cloaks, because at any moment, the sky could rain. Welcome to midday, the medieval version of the corporate lunch break. Except instead of grabbing a sandwich or doom-scrolling your phone, you're still toiling in a field, blistered hands wrapped around a wooden hoe, praying the sun doesn't boil your brain before you finish planting another row of barley. You thought mornings were rough? Afternoons are worse. They're longer, hotter, hungrier, and they hit differently when you haven't had enough calories to power a pigeon, let alone a full-grown adult doing manual labor. Let's set the scene. You're a serf, not quite a slave, but far from free. You don't own the land you work, your lord does. You're contractually obligated, in the way a dog is contractually obligated to stay in the yard, to till, sow, and harvest crops for someone else's profit. In exchange, you get a small plot to grow your own food. That's it. No benefits, no overtime pay, no dental. Today, your lord's fields take priority. You're working a long strip of land, turning dirt with a wooden plow that's barely holding together, guided by a skinny ox that looks more depressed than you. Your job? Keep moving, keep planting, keep not dying. You're covered in dust and sweat. Your clothes are made of itchy wool. Your shoes are probably just leather wrappings tied with string, if you're lucky enough to have any. Blisters? Guaranteed. Sunburn? Absolutely. Your only protection from the elements is a wide-brimmed hat and the vague hope that clouds will show up at some point. And then there's lunch. Or, as it's known in the 14th century, whatever scraps you managed to carry in a ragged cloth and didn't lose to rats or spoilage. Maybe it's some... And if you're pregnant, congratulations! You're now expected to keep working until the baby is practically crowning. There's no maternity leave, no prenatal care, just herbal teas, whispered prayers, and the village's collective trauma from every woman who didn't survive childbirth. Meanwhile, your kids, assuming they're over the age of 5, are already working. Maybe they're bird scaring in the fields, maybe hauling water, maybe apprenticing with a blacksmith or learning how to make shoes. Childhood isn't a golden age, it's just training for adult misery. Let's say it rains. You don't stop working, you just get muddy. The road turns to muck, your tools get slick, your clothes soak through. There's no Gore-Tex, no waterproof boots, just wet wool, chafing thighs, and a rising fear that your crops might rot in the ground before harvest. And that's the best-case scenario. The worst case? A hailstorm destroys your barley and your entire year's food supply is ruined. You don't get government aid, there's no crop insurance, just famine, hunger, desperation, and maybe a pilgrimage to the nearest relic site in the faint hope that kissing a saint's toenail would turn your luck around. Sometimes, while you're working, you hear the church bell, not just marking the hours, but tolling. The afternoon melts into early evening with a kind of slow, heavy resignation. You're still in the field, still working, and still pretending that your body isn't screaming at you to stop. But there's no clock to punch, no 5 o'clock whistle, and definitely no union rep to complain to. The sun decides when your day ends, and it's not feeling generous today. If you're lucky, maybe someone in your village has a bell that rings to mark Vespers, the evening prayer. Otherwise, you just glance at the shadow your ox casts and guess whether it's finally time to head home. But don't imagine this means you're done. Oh no, home isn't rest, it's just where the second shift begins. Picture this. Your home is a one-room cottage, maybe 2 rooms if you're middle-of-the-road fortunate. Wattle and daub walls, a thatched roof, hopefully not leaking, a packed earth floor, and no insulation. Your fire pit is right in the center of the room, smoke drifting lazily toward a small hole in the ceiling because chimneys aren't standard yet. Your eyes sting every time you try to cook. Your clothes constantly reek of smoke. If you have windows, they're just holes covered with oily linen or shutters, no glass, unless you're absurdly wealthy. You step inside and immediately get to work. The animals, yes, they're inside too, need food and water. You check the chickens, tether the goat, maybe scoop out the corner where the pig's been sleeping. The family pig isn't just a pet, it's dinner, someday. And until that day comes, it lives with you, eats your scraps, and makes your house smell like a barnyard. Your partner is kneading bread or boiling beans, the kids are bickering or curled up under a rough wool blanket, possibly scratching at flea bites. No one is clean. Soap exists, but it's harsh, rare, and evening is the time for prayer and storytelling. Someone might sing or recite a tale passed down orally for generations. Stories of dragons, saints, sinners, and the occasional miracle. These are your shows. No CGI, just voices in the firelight, retelling a world that's even harder than your own. And bedtime? It's not about comfort. It's about squeezing in sleep before the rooster drags you back to the fields. You sleep on a straw mattress stuffed with hay or rushes, probably infested with mites or lice. Your whole family sleeps in the same room, sometimes in the same bed. There's no privacy. If you're elderly or sick, you might sleep by the fire for warmth. If you're a kid, you're probably curled up with your siblings, arguing over the least itchy spot. There's no blanket per person. There's the blanket. If it's cold, everyone crowds together like medieval penguins, trying not to freeze. If it's hot, well, you sweat, and the fleas bite, and maybe you dream of being born a noble, or better yet, a miller. They always seem to eat better. Sunday finally arrives, and with it, a glimmer of hope. Not because you get to sleep in or binge watch medieval TikTok. No, because it's the one day you don't have to plow or dig. Sort of, mostly. But don't get too excited. Sunday is the Lord's Day, literally and figuratively. And that means it's time for church. Attendance isn't optional. Even if your muscles ache and your feet are blistered, you're expected to show up. Not doing so could raise eyebrows, prompt gossip, or worse, draw the attention of your local priest, who acts as a spiritual advisor and an unofficial social watchdog. So you drag yourself out of bed at dawn, again. Put on your best and only clothes. Maybe you try to brush the straw out of your hair, maybe. And you walk to church, sometimes miles through muddy fields, rain or snow, depending on the season. The medieval church service isn't exactly a pep rally. It's in Latin, a language you don't understand. You stand or kneel for most of it. Pews, not a thing yet. The priest chants, you murmur responses, and you try not to fall asleep or make eye contact with your neighbor's goats. And here's where medieval religion gets really interesting. It's not just about belief, it's about structure, control, and survival. The church dominates every part of life. From birth to death, it's there to guide you, judge you, and sometimes tax you. Yes, tax you. Ever heard of a tithe? That's a mandatory 10% of your income, or harvest, or animals donated to the church. So if you grow 10 sacks of grain, one goes straight to the church's granary, not negotiable. Even if your family is hungry, even if your crops barely came in. This is not a donation, it's spiritual rent. In return, the church offers salvation and protection to a degree. It's the medieval version of a social safety net with prayers thrown in. You're promised a better afterlife. Now let's talk about hygiene. Because if you think medieval life stank, well, you're absolutely right. Your modern nose wouldn't last 10 minutes in a medieval village. And if you somehow time traveled there, people wouldn't say you smelled nice. They'd probably assume you were an angel or possessed. Let's start with bathing. Did people bathe in the Middle Ages? Yes, but not daily, not even weekly in most cases. There were public bathhouses in some towns, inspired by Roman traditions, but they were few and far between. In villages, you were more likely to bathe in a river or a wooden tub, maybe a few times a year if water and weather allowed. Soap was a luxury. Most peasants used lye soap, a rough mixture made from ashes and animal fat. It got the job done, kind of, but it could also burn your skin if it wasn't made right. There's no conditioner, no shampoo, no essential oil blend to make you smell like vanilla or eucalyptus. You'd scrub yourself raw with what felt like chemical sludge and count yourself lucky. And remember, water wasn't always clean. Streams could be polluted by animals, waste, or tannery runoff. People sometimes avoided water entirely for fear of disease. Ironically, that meant they stayed dirtier to avoid illness because dirty water could kill you. Then there's your clothing. You have one outfit, maybe two if you're doing really well. These are wool or linen garments, and they don't get washed often. You wear them while working, sweating, sleeping, eating, and yes, even using the chamber pot. Laundry was done by hand, usually by women, and it was labor-intensive. So unless your clothes were truly unbearable, you kept wearing them. Teeth? No toothpaste. A twig and some salt? Maybe. People sometimes chewed aromatic herbs like mint or sage to freshen their breath. But if you lost a tooth, that was it. No dentist, no implants, no Novocaine. Just a lot of pain and possibly an infection that could spread and become life-threatening. A toothache in medieval times wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be a death sentence. Now let's go even lower. Toilet facilities were primitive. If you were lucky enough to have an outhouse, great. But in many villages, let's talk about food, specifically medieval food. Because while modern diets vary wildly depending on culture and income, in the Middle Ages, your menu was dictated almost entirely by your social class, the season, and the whims of the local harvest. If you were expecting burgers, fries, or even a hot cup of coffee, you're centuries too early. Let's start with the peasants, since they made up the overwhelming majority of the population. A typical peasant's diet was simple, repetitive, and extremely carb-heavy. Bread wasn't just a side dish, it was the foundation of most meals. But we're not talking fluffy loaves from a modern bakery. Medieval bread was coarse, dark, and often made with whatever grain was available, rye, barley, or oats. Sometimes it even had bits of dirt or grit in it from poorly milled flour. Over time, this could wear down your teeth like sandpaper. Your main meal might consist of pottage, a thick stew made from grains, vegetables, and occasionally meat, if you were lucky. Think of it as the slow-cooked, ever-simmering catch-all of the medieval kitchen. Cabbage, onions, peas, leeks, garlic, maybe some herbs if available. If someone in the village caught a rabbit or a bird, small pieces might find their way in. Otherwise, it was mostly plant-based by necessity. Now, let's be honest, the average medieval peasant was not getting their daily protein goal. Meat was scarce and expensive. Chickens and pigs were valuable for their eggs and offspring, not for slaughter. Cows were for milk, not steaks. So most protein came from beans, lentils, and sometimes dairy products, cheese and buttermilk if the animals were producing. Speaking of dairy, milk didn't come in cartons, and it wasn't pasteurized. It went sour fast, especially in the summer, and had to be consumed or turned into something else quickly. No refrigeration meant everything spoiled faster. Salt, smoking, and drying were the main preservation techniques, but those required time and resources. Often you just ate what you had, when you had it, and hoped not to get sick. Fruit and vegetables were seasonal and local. Forget bananas in winter or tropical smoothies. If apples were in season, great. If not, tough luck. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and carrots, which were originally purple or white, not orange, were common. Leafy greens were eaten when fresh, though they were also used medicinally, everything from nettles to dandelion. And what did they drink? Now let's get into the messy part of medieval life, literally, hygiene. Because if you thought food was rough in the Middle Ages, wait until you hear about how people handled cleanliness, illness, and basic bodily functions. Spoiler, you wouldn't want to time travel without a full hazmat suit and a gallon of hand sanitizer. Let's start with the elephant in the room, bathing. People did bathe in the Middle Ages, contrary to the myth that everyone just walked around covered in filth. But here's the twist, it wasn't every day, or even every week for most. For peasants, baths were occasional and often seasonal. Imagine timing your bath with a planting or harvest cycle, because if it's not growing season, it's bathing season. Water had to be hauled by hand or bucketed from a stream or well. Heating it was laborious, so most peasants bathed in cold water, often outside or in shared tubs. Soap existed, but was typically made from animal fat and lye, and it could be harsh on the skin. Hair washing? Rare. Head lice? Common. Shaving? That depended on your station, but most peasants let nature do its thing. Now, there were public bathhouses in medieval towns, kind of like ancient spas, but more rustic. You'd pay a small fee, maybe share a tub with a stranger, and get a good soak. These were more popular in cities and among the middle and upper classes. But over time, concerns about morality and the spread of disease led to a decline in public bathing. By the Renaissance, some folks thought bathing could actually cause illness by opening your pores to bad air. Speaking of bad air, welcome to the world of medieval medicine. The dominant medical theory was the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Your health depended on keeping these in balance. If you were sick, doctors or barbers might bleed you to restore harmony, either by lancing a vein or using leeches. That's right, the cure for your fever might be bloodletting or purging. Good luck! Medical knowledge was a patchwork of ancient texts, superstition, and trial and error. Physicians were trained in universities, but most common folk had no access to them. Instead, they relied on herbalists, midwives, and folk remedies. Got a headache? Try a poultice of crushed mint and vinegar. Feeling cursed? Better call the local wise woman or priest. Dentistry? Almost non-existent. Teeth rotted, abscesses festered, and toothaches were simply endured. If it got bad enough, someone might yank your tooth with pliers. Anesthetics? So, let's say you've had enough of medieval town life. You've choked on the stench, dodged chamber pot missiles, and survived a plague scare. Maybe you're thinking a weekend trip to the countryside sounds relaxing. Just hop in the old Toyota Corolla and take a scenic drive, right? Not quite. Welcome to the reality of medieval travel, a world without highways, without cars, and often without shoes. This wasn't just a pre-GPS inconvenience. This was a bone-rattling, time-devouring, sometimes deadly ordeal. And even if you made it to your destination, there was no promise you'd find food, shelter, or anything resembling a map. Let's start with the roads. Roman roads still existed in parts of Europe, at least in name, but many were falling apart, overtaken by nature or hijacked by local lords who turned them into toll traps. Outside of those rare stone paths, most roads were just dirt tracks. After a rainstorm, they became ankle-deep in mud. After a dry spell, they were rutted and dusty. Either way, they were rough on wheels and worse on feet. Most peasants didn't own wagons or horses. You walked for miles, in shoes made of leather that wore out fast, if you were lucky. Often it was barefoot travel over rocky terrain. And you'd better hope you were healthy, because even a twisted ankle could be a major setback. Walking from one town to another could take a full day or more. Long-distance journeys, we're talking weeks or months. Let's talk about animals. If you were wealthy or had a job that required it, you might travel by horse or mule. But medieval horses weren't the sleek, powerful breeds we romanticize today. Most were short, stocky, and built for labor, not luxury. Saddles were simple, and roads were so bad you were often better off walking beside your mount. Carts and wagons existed, but were slow and cumbersome, especially when loaded down. Wheels broke, axles snapped, and mud could swallow a cart whole. Travel was painfully slow, just a few miles per hour. You might make 15 to 20 miles on a good day. And don't expect inns and rest stops every few miles. Villages were sparse, and food was BYO, bring your own bread and maybe a little dried meat. And let's not forget the bandits. The medieval countryside could be lawless, especially in areas with weak local lords. Travel in groups or hire armed escorts, or risk being robbed, kidnapped, or worse. There were even travel bans in some regions. If you thought deciding what to eat in the modern world was tricky, do I want sushi, pizza, or just plain cereal? Imagine living in a time when every meal was a gamble. Spoiled food, mysterious gruel, and constant shortages made medieval eating less about pleasure and more about survival. First off, variety, forget it. Most peasants ate a monotonous diet of bread, porridge, and whatever veggies or legumes they could grow. Meat was rare and reserved mostly for the wealthy or on special occasions. Hunting was often illegal for peasants, punishable by severe fines or worse. So, for the average person, daily meals were carb-heavy but protein-poor. Bread was the staple, but quality varied drastically. Nobles had white bread made from finely sifted wheat flour, soft and light like a modern baguette. Peasants, their bread was dense, dark, and gritty, full of bran, rye, or even ground acorns mixed in when grain was scarce. Sometimes it was so tough and moldy that you'd need to soak it in broth or ale just to get it down. Speaking of ale, water was often unsafe to drink because it was contaminated with waste, chemicals, and all sorts of nastiness. Ale and beer, brewed daily and low in alcohol, were safer options, even for children. It's hard to imagine a world where beer is considered a health necessity, but that was medieval life. Vegetables were seasonal and limited to what could be grown or foraged locally. Onions, cabbage, leeks, beans, and peas were common. But many greens were bitter, and some, like wild mushrooms or certain herbs, were downright dangerous if misidentified. Now, on to meat. This was the luxury you'd dream about. But the medieval diet was complicated by social rules and religious observances. Meat was off limits on certain days, and even when allowed, fresh meat was hard to come by and expensive. The rich ate venison, boar, and poultry. Peasants mostly made do with salted or smoked pork or the occasional chicken or rabbit. Preservation was a nightmare. Without refrigeration, food spoiled fast. Salt was a precious commodity, used to cure meats and fish, but it was costly. Poorer folks relied on drying, smoking, pickling, or fermenting. Some of these methods improved flavor and shelf life, others just made the food smell funky enough to deter flies. And then there was the mystery of medieval cooking. Recipes were vague, often calling for a handful of this or a pinch of that. Spices were expensive imports reserved for the rich and could be dangerous if faked or adulterated. Black pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were luxury items, so most common folks cooked simple stews with whatever herbs they could find. Food safety was, well, almost non-existent. Poisoning from bad meat, tainted water, or mold was common. Foodborne illnesses ran rampant with little understanding of bacteria or hygiene. And kitchen fires, with open hearths and primitive tools, burns and accidents were everyday hazards. Feasts for nobles? A different story. They were grand, extravagant, and often showy affairs, with multiple courses and exotic dishes, sometimes involving live birds flying from pies or theatrical presentations. But even then, food could be heavily salted or spiced to mask spoilage, so not necessarily fresher, just better disguised. To sum it up, medieval eating was a precarious balancing act. Hunger, monotony, and risk were constants. If you survived childhood, you were lucky. If you made it to adulthood without poisoning yourself, you were downright fortunate. So, next time you complain about your boring salad or overcooked chicken, remember, medieval meals were survival stories, one bite at a time. If you think a bad hair day or skipping a shower for a day is rough, try imagining life where bathing regularly wasn't just uncommon, it was often downright dangerous. In medieval times, hygiene was a patchwork of superstition, lack of resources, and sheer practicality. The idea of daily bathing, brushing teeth, or washing clothes like we do today, almost non-existent, especially for the lower classes. For starters, baths were infrequent and often communal. Public bathhouses did exist, especially in towns, but they could be breeding grounds for disease rather than cleanliness. People feared that bathing opened pores and made them vulnerable to illnesses or evil spirits, a common medieval belief. So many simply avoided it. Bathing meant filling a large wooden tub with water heated over a fire. This was a luxury few could afford regularly because heating water took precious fuel and time. Most people washed their faces and hands daily if they could, but full body baths were rare and often reserved for special occasions or the wealthy. Clothes? Washing was labor-intensive and involved boiling, scrubbing, and drying. Peasants wore the same garments for months or even years. The scent of medieval clothes? Let's just say it probably wasn't fresh linen. Layers of dirt, sweat, and sweat-soaked fabric created a cocktail of smells that would make modern noses recoil. Tooth care was rudimentary. The wealthy sometimes used cloths or chew sticks made from twigs, but toothpastes as we know them didn't exist. People chewed herbs or used powders made from crushed shells, charcoal, or ashes. Cavities, gum disease, and tooth loss were widespread. No dentist visits here. Food in the Middle Ages? It's a mixed bag of scarcity, repetition, and some downright questionable choices. Your modern diet with endless fresh produce, protein options, and snacks on demand was unimaginable. For most people, especially peasants, the diet was basic, bland, and often barely enough to survive. The staple? Bread, but not the soft, fluffy stuff you know. Medieval bread was usually coarse, made from rye or barley mixed with bran, and sometimes even ground nutshells or other fillers when grain was scarce. This dense, hard bread was the mainstay of every meal. Alongside bread, pottage was the universal dish, a kind of thick, soupy stew made from vegetables, grains, and whatever bits of meat or fish were available. Peasants often ate it with wild greens like nettles or cabbage if they could find them. Protein was scarce and expensive. Meat was mostly for the wealthy or special occasions. Most peasants might eat meat only once a week, if at all. Preserved foods were common. Since refrigeration didn't exist, people salted, smoked, or pickled meat and fish to store them. Salt was a valuable commodity, sometimes called white gold. Without it, food spoiled quickly. Vegetables like onions, leeks, and beans were common. Fresh fruit was a treat, eaten seasonally. Honey was the main sweetener because sugar was rare and costly. Spices like pepper. When it comes to hygiene, medieval life was, well, let's just say it didn't win any cleanliness awards. Today, we take showers, running water, and toilets for granted. Back then, things were much messier and more hazardous to your health. First off, bathing was infrequent. The popular myth is that medieval people never bathed at all, but the truth is a bit more nuanced. Bathing was rare, but did happen, especially among the wealthy who had the means for tubs and servants. Most common folk, however, might bathe only a few times a year or just wash their hands and face regularly. Reasons for this scarcity included limited access to clean water, the belief that water opened pores to disease, and simply the labor involved in heating water. Instead of full baths, people often used linen cloths or sponges to wipe themselves down. Dry baths were common, involving rubbing the skin with cloths or powders made from herbs. Clothing hygiene was also poor. Changing clothes frequently was a luxury few could afford. People wore the same garments for weeks or months. Clothes were often made of wool or coarse linen, which could harbor lice and fleas. Wealthier people could afford to wash and replace clothing more often, but even their fabrics weren't washed as thoroughly or as often as we would today. Sanitation was perhaps the biggest challenge. Most towns and villages lacked proper sewage systems. Chamber pots were common in homes, but their contents were... If you thought hygiene was rough, wait until you hear about medieval medicine. The medical knowledge and practices during the Middle Ages were, well, a combination of superstition, trial and error, and a dash of genuine observation, but mostly the first two. First, doctors were few and far between, and medical training was very limited. Universities started teaching medicine in the 12th century, but their knowledge was mostly based on ancient Greek and Roman texts, especially Galen and Hippocrates, which were incomplete and sometimes just plain wrong by modern standards. The dominant medical theory was the humoral system, which claimed that the body contained four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that illness was caused by imbalances among them. Treatments aimed to restore this balance, often by bloodletting, purging, or applying leeches. Imagine going to your doctor and getting your blood drained for a headache. Sounds terrifying, right? Yet this was common practice. Surgery was rare and risky because there was no anesthesia and no antiseptics. Surgeons were often barbers or blacksmiths rather than formally trained doctors. If you had a broken bone or deep wound, your chances of surviving without infection were slim. Tools were reused without sterilization, spreading infections easily. Herbal remedies were widely used. Some plants like willow bark, which contained... Medieval food culture was a mixed bag of scarcity, superstition, and occasional indulgence. Definitely not the gourmet experience you might imagine. For most common folk, the diet was basic and repetitive. Lots of bread, porridge, legumes, and seasonal vegetables. Meat was a luxury for peasants and mostly reserved for special occasions, while the wealthy could feast on roasted game, fish, and imported spices. But don't think medieval peasants had fancy food preservation methods. Without refrigeration, fresh food had to be eaten quickly or dried, salted, or smoked. One major issue was the quality and safety of food. Moldy grains could cause ergotism, a deadly poisoning that led to convulsions and hallucinations. Contaminated water and food could cause dysentery and other intestinal illnesses. Remember, hygiene was nearly non-existent, so foodborne diseases were rampant. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were highly prized, not just for flavor, but because they could mask the taste of slightly spoiled food. This spice economy drove long and dangerous trade routes from Asia to Europe, making spices a status symbol for the rich. Eating habits were also influenced by religious fasting rules. During Lent or other fast days, meat and dairy were off the menu, replaced by fish or simple fare. This could lead to nutritional deficiencies, especially for peasants with limited options. Meals were often communal, and table manners were basic. Hands were washed with a communal bowl of water, and everyone shared from common dishes. Utensils were rare for peasants. Many ate with their hands or used pieces of bread as spoons. Alcoholic drinks were common because water was often unsafe. Ale and beer were staples for peasants, while wine was more common among the elite. These drinks were often safer than water because the brewing process killed pathogens. Surprisingly, medieval cooks had some impressive techniques like roasting, boiling, baking, and even early frying. Banquets for nobles could be lavish, with multiple courses and elaborate displays, but for the average person, food was about survival. So, if you lived in medieval times, you either dealt with a monotonous, bland diet with frequent risks of food poisoning, or enjoyed a rare feast that could also lead to a bellyache or worse. If you think your last visit to the doctor was bad, imagine living in a time when the local barber was your go-to health expert, because often that was the case. Medieval medicine was a strange mix of superstition, limited knowledge, and risky practices. Hospitals as we know them barely existed, and medical professionals were often monks, barbers, or herbalists with little formal training. The dominant medical theory was based on the ancient concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was thought to depend on the balance of these humors. If you had a fever or headache, chances are a doctor would try to rebalance you by bleeding you, applying leeches, or making you vomit. Sounds like a recipe for disaster, right? Surgery was rudimentary and often done with anesthesia. Imagine a patient screaming through a procedure with only alcohol or opium for pain relief. Amputations were common after battle wounds or infections, but infection control was non-existent. The dreaded gangrene or sepsis could set in, turning a simple injury into a death sentence. Herbal remedies were popular, using plants like willow bark, which contains natural aspirin, garlic, and mint. While some treatments had real benefits, many were useless or even harmful. Magic charms, prayers, and rituals were also common, reflecting the strong belief in supernatural causes of illness. Plagues and epidemics struck regularly, with the Black Death in the 14th century killing millions. Medieval medicine was helpless against such outbreaks, often resorting to quarantine or blaming scapegoats. So, if you got sick in medieval times, your chances of survival depended as much on luck as skill. The idea that medicine was a science was still centuries away.
Picture this. You're sitting down for a meal in the medieval period. What's on your plate? Well, if you were a peasant, it might be not much. The medieval diet was heavily influenced by social class and geography. Nobles enjoyed rich, extravagant feasts with multiple courses, exotic spices imported from faraway lands, and plenty of meat. Peasants? Their daily meals were repetitive, simple, and often insufficient. The staple of a peasant's diet was pottage, a thick, soupy stew made from whatever vegetables, grains, or legumes were available. Think boiled cabbage, onions, beans, and occasionally some scraps of meat or fish if you were lucky. Bread was a main source of calories, but often coarse and dark, made from rye or barley rather than wheat, which was reserved for the upper classes. Meat was a luxury for peasants, mostly reserved for special occasions or seasonal hunts. Even then, the quality was poor and preservation was primitive, so spoilage was common. Fish was more accessible for those near rivers or coasts, but not everyone had that option. Malnutrition and food shortages were widespread. The lack of variety led to vitamin deficiencies, scurvy from lack of vitamin C, rickets from vitamin D deficiency, and other ailments. Food poisoning was a real threat, thanks to poor sanitation and storage. For nobles, the picture was very different. Banquets showcased elaborate dishes, roasted swan, peacock, or boar, often presented with dramatic flair. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, and saffron weren't just for flavor. They were a status symbol, imported at great expense. Honey was the primary sweetener, as sugar was rare. Drinks varied too. Ale and beer were common for peasants, often safer than water. Nobles preferred wine, sometimes diluted with water, but always plentiful. So, if you were a medieval peasant, your daily diet was a gamble between survival and malnutrition. The rich, on the other hand, indulged in extravagance that would make modern foodies jealous. Medieval medicine? Imagine trusting your health to leeches, prayers, and some guy with a rusty blade. Healthcare back then was a wild mix of superstition, rudimentary science, and a desperate hope you'd survive long enough to see a doctor. Actually, doctor is generous. Most medieval medical practitioners were barbers, monks, or wise women using a mix of herbal remedies, bleeding, and religious rituals. The
Eating in medieval times was a whole different ordeal compared to our modern, convenience-packed kitchens. Your survival would depend a lot on what you ate and how often. Most common folk lived on a diet heavy in grains, especially coarse bread made from rye or barley, which was often hard and full of grit. Wheat bread was a luxury for the wealthy. Porridge, made from oats or other grains, was a breakfast staple. Vegetables like onions, garlic, cabbage, and beans were common, but fresh produce could be scarce, especially in winter. Meat was a treat rather than a regular part of the diet for peasants. Hunting was often restricted by law to nobles, so most people ate salted or dried meat when they could get it, or more commonly, fish if near water. Monks and clergy sometimes had better diets due to monastery resources. Food preservation was primitive. Smoking, salting, drying, or pickling were the main methods. Without refrigeration, fresh food spoiled fast, leading to foodborne illnesses. Sugar was extremely rare and expensive. Instead, honey was used to sweeten dishes. Spices, which were status symbols and pricey imports, flavored the meals of the rich, but peasants ate mostly bland fare. Drinking water was often unsafe, so people drank ale or weak beer daily, at any age. The alcohol content was low, but it was safer than the contaminated water. Wine was another luxury, mostly for the upper class. Meals were eaten with hands or simple wooden utensils, and hygiene was spotty. Imagine eating bread that had been handled by multiple grimy hands, or sharing food with a family in a cramped, smoky hut. For the wealthy, feasts were grand, with multiple courses, exotic spices, and roasted meats. But for the average medieval person, it was a struggle to get enough calories, with a diet low in protein and variety. Malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies were common, leading to weak immune systems and poor health overall. Scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, was especially deadly during winter months. So, could you survive on medieval food? If you like bland, gritty bread, occasional stews, and ale instead of water, you might last, but it would be tough. If you think skipping a shower for a day or two is rough, imagine living in medieval times, where in medieval times, hygiene was pretty much non-existent by modern standards, and it's honestly one of the most stomach-churning things to think about. Bathing was rare. Many people believed that water opened the pores to evil spirits or diseases, so they avoided washing their bodies regularly. When they did bathe, it might be just once or twice a year, often at fairs or religious festivals. Some nobles had private baths, but the average person went weeks or months without washing properly. Clothing was infrequently cleaned. People wore the same smelly, lice-infested garments for days or weeks. Bed linens were rarely changed, which turned homes into breeding grounds for fleas and bedbugs. Public sanitation was terrible. Waste disposal systems were primitive. Chamber pots were emptied onto streets or into rivers, which were also the main sources of drinking water. Open sewers ran alongside streets, spreading foul smells and germs. This meant diseases like typhus, dysentery, cholera, and the plague spread quickly. Medieval cities were hotspots for epidemics because people lived so close together with such poor sanitation. Even monks and nuns struggled with hygiene. Some monasteries had rudimentary latrines, but many did not. People relied on herbs and incense to mask odors rather than cleaning themselves. Imagine trying to sleep with lice crawling through your hair and fleas biting you all night, while the stench of human waste lingers in the air. That was daily life. Medical knowledge was limited, and no one understood germs or bacteria. They attributed disease to bad smells, miasma, or supernatural causes, not dirt and infection. Basically, you'd be shocked at how filthy and uncomfortable life was. Hygiene was a luxury few could afford or even imagine. Food in the medieval period was a mixed bag, often bland, sometimes scarce, and frequently unsafe by today's standards. Most people ate a simple diet based heavily on grains like barley, rye, and oats, which were turned into coarse bread or porridge. Medieval medicine was a wild mix of superstition, limited knowledge, and sometimes downright dangerous practices. If you got sick, chances were slim that you'd get proper treatment, and many common illnesses could easily turn fatal. Doctors based their understanding of the body on ancient theories like the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The idea was that health depended on these fluids being balanced, so treatments often aimed to rebalance them. This meant practices like bloodletting, cutting or leeching to drain blood, purging, or making patients vomit, which could weaken you even more. Herbs were the main form of medicine, with healers using plants like garlic, willow bark, an early form of aspirin, and chamomile. But without understanding germs or infection, these remedies were hit or miss. Hospitals existed, but were more like places for care and prayer than healing centers. Surgery was rare and risky. No anesthesia, no sterilization, so even minor wounds could get infected and lead to death. The Black Death, bubonic plague, was a devastating reminder of how little medieval medicine could do. People tried everything from quarantine to religious rituals, but the true cause, bacteria spread by fleas, was unknown. For everyday illnesses like colds or fevers, people often relied on folk remedies, charms, or prayers, with no guarantee of recovery. In short, if you caught the flu or a serious infection in medieval times, your odds of survival weren't great, and treatment might make things worse. Eating in the Middle Ages was nothing like the diverse, flavor-packed meals we enjoy today. If you think skipping a shower for a day is bad, imagine what life was like in medieval times, where the idea of hygiene was vastly different from ours, and not in a good way. Most medieval people bathed rarely, often just once or twice a year, usually in the spring and fall. This wasn't just laziness. Public bathhouses existed, but were often linked to disease spread or were associated with immoral behavior. Plus, heated water was a luxury. Instead of bathing, people relied on dry washing, wiping themselves down with cloth or changing their linen undergarments. The wealthy might have access to scented oils or perfumes, but the common folk had no such luck. Dental hygiene? Almost non-existent. People didn't brush their teeth the way we do now. Bad breath, tooth decay, and gum disease were widespread. Toothpicks, sometimes made of metal or bone, were used occasionally. Clothing was washed infrequently. Many people wore the same garments for weeks or months, leading to infestations of lice and fleas. These parasites were a constant nuisance and carriers of disease. Sewage and waste disposal were rudimentary at best. Chamber pots were emptied into the streets or nearby rivers, which were also sources of drinking water, creating a perfect storm for the spread of deadly diseases like cholera and dysentery. All in all, if you lived in medieval times, you'd be dealing with foul smells, skin infections, and a constant battle against germs without even knowing what they were. If you think your diet today is bland or repetitive, imagine surviving on a medieval menu where variety was limited and food safety was practically non-existent. Most medieval people's diets were based on whatever they could grow or afford. For peasants, this meant lots of grains like rye, barley, and oats, often weighed into coarse bread or pottage, a kind of stew or porridge. Meat was a luxury, usually reserved for nobles, and even then, it wasn't as common as you might think. Preserving food was tricky. Without refrigeration, people relied. If you think a scrape or a cold is no big deal today, imagine facing them in medieval times. Medicine back then was a patchwork of superstition, guesswork, and some surprisingly clever herbal remedies, but mostly it was a mess. Doctors were often monks or barber surgeons who learned through apprenticeships, not formal education. The humorous theory dominated. Health was about balancing blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you got sick, it was probably because your humors were out of whack, so treatments included bloodletting, cutting you to let blood out, leeches, or purging, all of which could do more harm than good. Antiseptics, antibiotics, forget it. A simple infection could turn deadly. Surgery was brutal, with no anesthesia or sterilization. You'd be lucky if a surgeon didn't accidentally make things worse with unclean tools. People also relied heavily on charms, prayers, and superstition. Sometimes the cure was more psychological than physical, and many illnesses were blamed on curses or divine punishment. Bottom line, a small injury could turn fatal, and diseases that are easily treatable today could wipe out entire villages. Forget your daily showers and deodorant. Medieval hygiene was basically non-existent by modern standards, and it shows why people back then had a reputation for, well, smelling pretty terrible. Most people only bathed a few times a year, if at all. Baths were often seen as risky because of the belief that water could carry disease into the body. Instead, people might just wipe down with a damp cloth or use perfumes and herbs to mask the smell. But let's be honest, that only helped so much. Public bathhouses existed, but they were often centers of gossip, questionable behavior, and sometimes disease spread. Plus, they were more common in towns and cities than in rural villages, where dirt, sweat, and grime just accumulated. Teeth? Brushing wasn't really a thing. People used cloths or sticks, sometimes mixed with abrasive powders, but dental care was rudimentary at best. Tooth decay, bad breath, and gum disease were rampant. And with open sewers, crowded living spaces, and no indoor plumbing, contamination and disease spread like wildfire. You'd likely live surrounded by filth and pests, and you would be part of the problem without even knowing it. If you think medieval medicine, brace yourself. It was a wild mix of superstition, guesswork, and a bit of trial and error. Hospitals as we know them today didn't really exist. Instead, places called hospices or infirmaries were run mostly by monks or religious orders, focusing more on prayer than curing. Doctors were rare, and many treatments were downright bizarre. Bloodletting was popular, the idea being that illness came from imbalanced humors in the body. So they'd cut you or use leeches to drain blood, hoping to restore balance. Spoiler, this often made things worse. Herbs and potions were common, but no antibiotics or vaccines. Surgery was brutal, done without anesthesia, and infections were almost guaranteed. If you got seriously ill, your best hope was care from family or religious communities. Otherwise, disease and injury could quickly turn fatal. In other words, the doctor was often your barber, and a trip to the hospital was more about dying with some comfort than getting better. No conversation about medieval life is complete without mentioning the Black Death, the plague that wiped out about a third of Europe's population in the mid-14th century.
Imagine living in a time when a single cough or flea bite could mean instant doom. The plague spread fast, fueled by crowded cities, filthy streets, and a complete lack of understanding about germs. People blamed everything from bad air, miasma, to divine punishment. Some towns tried locking themselves down. Others blamed and persecuted minority groups, making a bad situation even worse. Medical knowledge was practically non-existent, so fear and superstition ruled. The plague doctors, with their life for peasants in medieval times, was relentless, with dawn to dusk packed with exhausting labor and barely any breaks. Most peasants worked the land they didn't even own, growing crops like barley, wheat, and rye, alongside vegetables and raising animals. Their days started early, often before sunrise, tending to fields, fixing fences, collecting firewood, and managing livestock. Their homes were tiny, made from wattle and daub with thatched roofs, usually just 1 or 2 rooms. Basic furniture, a hearth for cooking and warmth, and dirt floors were all they had. Meals were simple: pottage, a thick stew of vegetables and grains, coarse bread, and occasionally some salted meat or cheese if lucky. Community was crucial. Villages shared common fields, and labor was often a group effort. Yet, despite hard work, peasants lived on the edge of survival, vulnerable to bad harvests, disease, and heavy taxes imposed by their lord. If you think your Monday is tough, imagine waking up every day knowing your entire family's survival depends on your backbreaking under the sun. If you imagine medieval food as endless roasted meats and feasts, think again, especially for common folk. The medieval diet varied drastically by class, season, and region, but for peasants and townsfolk, it was mostly simple, repetitive, and often barely enough to stave off hunger. Grains were the staple: barley, oats, rye, and wheat, ground into coarse bread or boiled into pottage, a watery stew with whatever vegetables were available: onions, leeks, cabbage, and sometimes peas or beans. Meat was a luxury for peasants, eaten mostly on feast days or special occasions. More often, they relied on salted or smoked fish, eggs. In medieval times, personal hygiene was vastly different from today's standards. Contrary to popular belief, people did bathe, but not nearly as often as we do now, and often not in the way you'd expect. Public bathhouses existed in many towns and cities where people could bathe communally. However, these places sometimes became hubs for spreading disease, and some religious authorities even frowned upon them, associating public baths with immorality or temptation. Daily washing usually involved just washing the face and hands with a cloth or sponge. Full body bathing was rare and often considered unnecessary or even unhealthy, since some believed water opened the pores to disease. Clothing was typically changed more often than the body was washed. People relied on airing out clothes or changing linen undergarments to stay clean. Also, the lack of modern sewage systems meant waste disposal was a huge problem. Streets were often filthy, and rivers, used as water sources, became polluted. So, if you think skipping a shower for a day is gross, imagine living when people might go months or years without a full bath. Eating in the Middle Ages wasn't the gourmet experience we enjoy now. It was often a daily battle against hunger, spoilage, and monotony. The diet was heavily based on what you could grow or hunt locally. For peasants, that meant lots of bread, often coarse and dark, porridge made from barley or oats, vegetables like onions, cabbage, and beans, and occasionally some cheese or salted fish. Meat was a rare treat for common folk since livestock was too valuable alive. Preserving food was tricky. Without refrigeration, most meat was salted, smoked, or pickled. Spoiled food was a constant risk.
Life in the Middle Ages was hard, but people still found ways to enjoy themselves. Just don't expect binge watching or video games. Entertainment was mostly communal and outdoors. Festivals, fairs, and religious holidays were major events that broke up the monotony of daily labor. These celebrations often included music, dancing, jousting tournaments, and theatrical plays called mystery plays that retold Bible stories. For the nobility, hunting was a favorite pastime and also a way to demonstrate status. Banquets featured storytelling and minstrels playing lutes and other instruments. In towns, markets doubled as social hubs where gossip, news, and jokes circulated alongside goods. Board games like chess and backgammon were popular among the wealthy, but even peasants had simpler games involving dice or stones. Literacy rates were low, so oral tradition, stories, ballads, and riddles was key to entertainment and passing down culture. Of course, life was still brutal, and laughter was often a way to cope with hardship. After walking through all the hardships, dangers, and quirks of medieval life, it's clear why modern comforts feel like a blessing. The medieval world was unforgiving. Disease,